Welcome. This is the presentation of the third chapter of our new Principles of Economics. This chapter deals with the question of values. Here, by values, we mean judgments with respect to general properties of social and economic systems and their outcomes.
Values in this sense are not often discussed in basic expositions of economics. Therefore, we start our chapter by explaining why we think economists must deal with this topic and which basic approach we choose to analyze it. We continue with a discussion of core concepts of economics and markets that, as we will explain, are inevitably imbued with values, starting with freedom and its relationship to rationality and social interdependence, and then moving on to efficiency and its relation to progress and competition. Based on this discussion, we then set out how, in our view, economists should deal with the question of values, particularly when it comes to the market as a framework to allocate scarce resources.
So, why do we need to discuss values in economics? There appears to be a tension between economists' scientific claim of objectivity and the wide variety of research traditions and eventually policy recommendations that clearly put different weights to different values. Now, some people would argue that this variety invalidates the potential of economics to provide objective results altogether. We think that this is a false conclusion. It ignores the character of economics as a performative science and the fact that the interaction between the economist as observer and the economy as the observed object must be an integral part of economic analysis. If looked at this way, values are an endogenous part of economic analysis, and that is basically how we approach them. As we will explain later, this also means that economists should render these values explicit when they spell out policy recommendations, for example, in terms of using markets as an allocation mechanism.
There are roughly two ways in which economists have traditionally approached values. The first is to approximate a third-person view, for example, by concentrating on empirical experiments or strictly restricting the use of economic analysis to a means to ends that are defined externally. We do not find this particularly convincing. Inevitably, any experiment that is performed on human beings imbues value judgments, for example, on the non-violation of human rights. And even if, for example, market-based allocation is recommended as superior to alternatives in terms of reaching an objective such as efficiency, this recommendation is certainly not value neutral, as we will show.
As the second way, some economists, such as those in the Austrian tradition, take certain values, such as individual freedom, to be constitutive of economics and eventually present them as superior to others in terms of generating better material outcomes. Other economists postulate that in view of the manifest variety of values, economics need to be diverse as well. This is akin to our own approach, with the important qualification that in a performative science, a standard of objectivity is still possible and can be approximated by impartiality. We will return to this point in the last part of our presentation.
So, what are the key values that are associated with economic analysis? In line with our definition of economics that we developed in the last chapter, we will focus on values that are associated with markets. We will discuss how the core concepts of freedom and individual autonomy, rationality, and efficiency are value imbued, and how they relate to competition, a concept that turns out to be value imbued itself. In the course of this, we will also discuss the role of progress and social interdependence in the general sense.
Let us start with freedom, then. Markets entail voluntary decision-making by market participants, and voluntariness implies freedom. Freedom is a value on its own, but it also has an important anchoring function for the purported agnosticism of economics with regard to other values. Essentially, those other values are treated as preferences which individuals are to choose on their own. Following the old Latin wisdom, de gustibus non est disputandum, roughly, matters of taste are not to be disputed. The market then is regarded as a social domain where preferences are expressed and translated into voluntary economic exchange, subject only to endowment constraints. Suppliers recognize and adapt to the preference of buyers as consumers, and the satisfaction of these preferences is the ultimate objective of economic activity. Therefore, according to this view, markets only require a minimal consent on values. In positive terms, markets are cosmopolitan and emancipatory in terms of expanding the domain of human freedom.
There is an important connection between voluntariness and economic welfare. This comes via the assumption that market participants will only engage in market transactions that make them better off. In a way, freedom as a value would thereby become neutralized as a mere instrument for the maximization of economic well-being. This is an argument that is well known as the so-called invisible hand theorem and corresponds to the Pareto optimality of market results. Markets thus would be value neutral, and a correspondingly value neutral state would then only have to assure that voluntariness is respected and harmful behavior outlawed, such as by instituting a framework of property rights.
However, unfortunately, things are not that straightforward. One major problem is the possibility of interdependent preferences. This is empirically highly relevant. People do have concerns about other people's choices, and their well-being can be affected by them even if no physical harm is involved. Think of dress codes and religious preferences as classic examples. A closely connected issue is social preferences, such as envy and compassion. Preference can also have an expressive character, sometimes linked to the social concept of identity. Think of someone who turns vegetarian because he defines himself as an environmentalist, despite the fact that he would prefer to eat meat.
In all these cases, market results would no longer necessarily be Pareto optimal, which is sometimes referred to as the paradox of the Paretian liberal. Rather, in economic parlance, market interaction is abundant with externalities, which by definition cannot be endogenously regulated by the market. As we know, the internalization of externalities can happen in different ways, including private negotiations and state intervention, not all of which maximize individual freedom. Trade-offs then become inevitable.
A related problem with regarding market results as value neutral is that people may have direct preferences over market outcomes in terms of distributional justice. This does not only concern the perception of distribution of wealth and income at a certain point of time, but also the conditions of getting there. In fact, market outcomes can feed back on capacities to transact on markets. For example, when workers who specialize on very specific tasks within a firm face a deterioration of their bargaining position on the labor market.
True, but some economists have tried to circumvent the question of distributional outcomes by focusing on procedural criteria. For example, it can be postulated that the rules of the game for markets can hypothetically be agreed upon by unanimous decision of all concerned individuals in a kind of original assembly. However, when we look at this more closely, procedural rules are not value-free either. Think, for example, of the question of participation in such an assembly. Should children or representatives of animals have a say?
Another issue with freedom as value is its connection with the concept of rationality. Rational behavior is another precondition for the Pareto optimality of markets. Without it, we cannot presume that market transactions always improve participants' well-being. Importantly, this requires that individuals' decisions are time-consistent and that they invest into processing an adequate amount of information in order to enable rational choice.
Clearly, rationality as an organizing principle for markets is not value neutral. Think of different perceptions of marriage markets across time and space. A rational approach to marriage is deeply entrenched in many traditional societies, whereas it is actively rejected, for example, in Western romantic culture.
But even in markets where rationality is acknowledged as an explicit or implicit benchmark, the question is what happens if market participants behave otherwise. Behavioral economics provides many examples for irrational behavior, such as time-inconsistent preferences for health insurance over the life cycle.
In this case, freedom and rationality would figure as separate values standing in a trade-off relationship. If freedom prevails, the market mechanism would imply to leave people alone with the consequences of irrational or suboptimal decisions, which in certain situations many would regard as immoral. If rationality prevails, this would open the door to a paternalistic state, enforcing certain patterns of behavior. Clearly, there's no value-free way of deciding between these alternatives.
Let us now turn to the second overarching topic associated with the notion of values in economics, namely the concept of efficiency. In a most general sense, efficiency is regarded as the attainment of an objective under scarcity of resources with a minimum amount of waste. In economics, this objective is mostly associated with the production of goods and services. Is it value neutral?
Well, efficiency is closely associated with the notion of progress, as enshrined, for example, in the idea of human development pursued by the United Nations. And indeed, there are certain material conditions, such as sufficient nutrition, health, and physical security, that universally contribute to an improvement of subjective well-being. That would directly link efficiency to a third-person perspective.
But still, when you think about it, progress is a value-loaded concept. For example, some religions are explicitly negative about pursuing material benefit as a life objective. They also would regard human life as sacred and not subject to efficiency considerations for principal reasons. This is clearly not followed in modern markets. For example, to enable the pricing of private health or life insurance, it is rather uncontroversial that a monetary value needs to be put on human life. The same is true, explicitly or implicitly, for decisions on scarce resources in medical treatment, as recently experienced quite harshly in the COVID pandemic.
Like in the case of freedom, therefore, efficiency is a value whose implementation eventually involves trade-offs with other values. A famous example is the equity-efficiency trade-off. The idea that a certain amount of inequality is economically necessary to keep up incentives for economic activity, including risk-taking and innovation. But as we have seen, the pursuing of efficiency can also impact on non-economic values. As an example, consider the distinction between gift exchange and market exchange in labor markets. Gift-based labor exchange can often clearly be inefficient, such as when too many relatives offer their help in building a house. On the other hand, its replacement by arm's-length labor markets can have a deep impact on social cohesion.
Although they are often seen as quasi-universalist benchmarks for economic activity and outcomes, the notions of progress and efficiency also have analytical limits. This is particularly clear when it comes to environmental issues. For example, when deciding on the allocation of resources for environmental policies, including climate change, a crucial question is the share of the burden between the present and future generations. That is, the determination of the social discount rate. Efficiency alone cannot address this issue. Rather, such a decision will often reflect deeper social and cultural values, such as the appreciation of long-term orientation and frugality.
Even more fundamentally, the progress concept traditionally has an anthropocentric character. That is, the view that the economy serves human purposes exclusively. This has become controversial from an environmental protection point of view. An alternative would be so-called deep ecology thinking. Proponents see humans as caretakers of the Earth system as a whole, such that we also must pay respect to the welfare of all forms of life on Earth. This has important economic consequences. Take the maintenance of biodiversity as an example. Should this just happen from a human welfare perspective? So, for instance, should we care for bees only as long as alternative technologies for pollination in agriculture are not available? Or are animal or plant species worth preserving in their own right? As such, again, the notion of efficiency cannot provide an answer to those questions.
We have now presented our argument that many core concepts related to economics and markets, such as the freedom to choose preferences, rationality, and efficiency, are in fact imbued with values. However, many of these notions can be seen as an endogenous result of competition, a concept to which we turn now. The idea here is that while irrational and efficient behavior can occur, they will eventually be weeded out by competitive forces. As an example, take a family business with a traditional-oriented production structure that includes a loyal but comparatively unproductive staff, such as a small bakery. Profit is low and competitive pressure is rising. Thus, although the family may be ready to trade off the maintenance of tradition against lower income, external competition may enforce rationalization in the sense of increasing efficiency, and alternative values may become unsustainable. So, is competition the objective third-person anchor that would decide about the prevalence of other values?
Well, there are two perspectives to this. First, as we will point out in more depth later, the allocation of resources in a competitive market process requires active institutional decisions, at least in modern economies. We already referred to this in the context of performativity. Profits are not generated and determined in a vacuum. They stem from accounting methods that must be institutionally defined in the first place. The necessity of setting institutions means that the decision to organize resource allocation in this competitive way is not without alternatives, and therefore certainly value imbued.
Second, these institutions are then subject to higher-level competitive forces themselves, such as the competition of jurisdictions that we will look at more closely in a later chapter. So institution setting is certainly not arbitrary, but subject to competitive constraints. Does that mean that values become entirely endogenous to the selective force of competition such that, in the longer run at least, only those values would survive that they are compatible with efficiency?
We can answer this question with no, simply because competition is itself subject to great variety. For example, with respect to criteria and intensity. Consider again our family business. It may be able to carve out a market segment in which consumers are actively willing to pay more for the upholding of traditional production methods. And it might also find sources of finance that would keep it sustainable, such as from well-off private financiers or state subsidies.
Or, on a higher level, look at the variety of economic systems. The German-style social market economy, non-capitalist market economies, and even fully planned economies are all more or less deficient from a standard efficiency perspective. But historically, they proved sustainable for considerable stretches of time. This coexistence provides ample niches for apparently inefficient structures and the values associated with them.
In the evolutionary perspective that we will fully unfold from the next chapter on, niche formation plays an important role. It points to the ability of human actors to actively shape the conditions of competition within which they are operating, and therefore make active choices on which values they want to pursue. Yet, competition in many contexts remains a fundamental force towards more efficiency, and therefore restrains the range of sustainable values in various ways. The decay and death of many traditional social structures as a consequence of economic development bear ample witness to this. In that sense, value change is indeed an endogenous result of progress and can be analyzed as such. Values shape how we perform markets, while at the same time, market competition creates forces that change our values or require that we find new ways to express them.
This concludes our discussion of core concepts and their relation to values. Where does all this leave us with respect to markets as main subjects of economic science and their relation to values?
The key takeaway is that a decision for or against markets as mechanism to allocate scarce resources, it's not value-free. Rather, the market mechanism is inextricably enmeshed with fundamental value propositions, such as freedom and individual autonomy, but also rationality and efficiency, and an acceptance of certain forms of inequality. Those stand in tension with other values and social models, such as traditional and socially static societies, egalitarian models, and religious concepts related to sacred domains. Markets are an essential element of promoting economic efficiency and progress, but both of these are ultimately values themselves that are subject to active human decision-making. The adoption and translation of these values into market behavior by market participants is a key feature of the performativity of markets.
All this means that economists should be explicit about the values they advocate. In particular, they should recognize that in many instances, a decision for or against a market arrangement is primarily a question of values, not of efficiency. Therefore, economists also need to reflect upon the eventual performative character of their analysis and recommendations. Does that mean that the notion of objectivity in our parlance, the generalization from second person to a third person perspective, has to be abandoned altogether?
In our view, there are two answers to this. First, we share the view of many economists that a key contribution of the discipline to political and social discourse is an analysis of trade-offs, implying a potential diversity of values at stake. This diversity, as we said, needs to be made explicit, and on this basis we can well be dealt with from a third-person perspective. Second, in an approach that includes the performative character of economics, objectivity can be approximated by impartiality. By impartiality, we mean that a genuinely scientific position must be independent of any of the interests involved in a specific situational context, including the scientist's own interest.
In our view, this has important implications on how economics should be organized as a discipline, a point that we will elaborate upon later in chapters 17 and 18. Briefly, one key aspect is to allow for diversity of values, including more internal competition between different viewpoints within the discipline that are grounded in this diversity. Another is the necessity of stringent professional ethics for academic economists, in particular, strict neutrality vis-à-vis extra academic interest groups.
This concludes our presentation on economics and values. Let us now briefly review and summarize what we have learned.
First, we have seen that there is a large variety of positions and schools of thought in economics regarding the relative role and significance of values. Economics is a performative science, so it cannot neutralize the diversity of values by achieving a third-person view. But economists can aspire for achieving impartiality of their judgments.
We then turn to the issue of freedom. The analytical assumption of subjectivity of preferences reflects the fundamental role of freedom for market analysis. However, we need to consider that this includes the freedom to assume preferences about preferences that others have. That is, preferences can be interdependent. Therefore, market results are not necessarily Pareto optimal. Also, people may have preferences over the distributional features of market results and potentially the procedural criteria by which these market results are achieved. The question on how initial endowments affect market results and how this distribution is to be judged is imbued with values and cannot be neutralized by the voluntariness of market transactions. Freedom is and remains a value proposition.
We then showed that freedom is tied to rationality, which has the status of a value as well. It cannot be neutralized as a mere analytical principle once we acknowledge that, first, individuals are free to act irrationally, and second, that rationality as an organizing principle for markets is not uncontroversial and can be treated differently across cultures.
Efficiency, another core category, is closely tied to the Enlightenment notion of human progress and is partly related to universal improvements of subjective well-being. Yet, there are deep tensions with widely held ethical and religious values. In this context, we saw that market competition can be an important driver of efficiency, but is always institutionally embedded. These institutions are then subject to multi-level competition with an important role for the formation of niches.
Finally, we looked at implications for economics as a discipline. Economists need to recognize that a decision for or against markets is ultimately based on values, not only efficiency considerations. Economic academia needs institutional frames to safeguard and enhance the impartiality of academic economists.
This brings us to the end of this presentation. In the next chapter, we will start our exposition of economics as we see it by exploring its evolutionary and ecological foundations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.